Again this morning we are with Secretary Bill Usery, U.S. Secretary of Labor and good friend. My name is Dr. Les Huff. I'm here with Caroline Blumenthal of the Library Reference Department here at Georgia State University. The date is February 25th, 1987, and we are continuing on this morning to explore with Mr. Usery early experiences of both his ancestors, and probably will be moving quickly into a discussion of his parents' lives and the family life of the Usery family as he was born into it and grew up. I would like to just touch on some of the stories that you were mentioning as we opened our discussion before turning on the tape recorders this morning. You mentioned having discussed in recent years with various relatives and visiting some of the sites where family members had lived. Do you want to talk just briefly about that? We will probably come back to it, as I said earlier, but tell me a little bit about how you learned this information, and then maybe what you've learned to this day.
Well, let's talk a little bit first about my mother's side. My grandfather's name was Roland R. Williamson, and as I indicated earlier, he married a Mercer, Miss Ceola Mercer, and they had a number of kids, which my mother was the oldest, and her name was Effie Mae Williamson. She had a sister. The next in line was named Molly Williamson, and then the next would be Lucille Williamson, and then they had the first son was born was Luke Williamson, and then another daughter, Martha Williamson, and then another son, Bill Williamson, and then the youngest of the family was Bessie Williamson. They did have one other sister that died shortly after birth, which obviously I never knew, and she died very young at the time. My mother being the oldest, and she was born, and as I indicated, in Upper Jones County, close to Putnam County and close to Jasper County, in a area that at that time when she was there was apparently quite a little village. It was a crossroads, and because there were very few cars or very few public roads at that time. But long since that village has done away with. The U.S. government in later years purchased all the land around it, and it's a wild game refuge. But there is a cemetery there where my grandparents are born, and the cemetery was quite a sizable cemetery. And as a young kid, I used to go with my grandparents and them to the cemetery once or twice a year for cleaning the cemetery. And of course, they would clean the whole cemetery, as it was no a public way of upkeep of the cemetery, so they did it themselves. And my grandfather felt very strong about this, and I can't remember the dates, but it was 2 annual dates a year that he went. And of course, it wasn't uncommon to have cemetery cleaning, and people would usually take picnic lunches or take lunches, and he would take the various tools that's needed to cut bushes and cut grass and sweep and clean and put headstones back that had gotten thrown around. And my grandfather would point out where there was a lot of buildings and houses and so forth. So when he was really young, he grew up there, and of course that's where he was living when, and it was a big farm when his father left home and never returned. Well, as I've indicated earlier, they were as my grandmother used to tell me, and my mother, they were about to starve to death because they weren't able to make any living. And my grandmother insisted that they move back to another part of the county where she grew up, where she owned some land herself. I'm not sure whether my grandfather owned any land or not. I don't know. I can't remember that anyone has ever told me whether he was farming someone else's land or partially his or what, but I know that they didn't have very much. My mother has told me about when they moved from this part to other, that they moved in the wagon. All the things they had was in a wagon, and that they had 2 cows, and my mother and my aunt, May or Molly, would sit on the back of the wagon, but the cows wouldn't follow the wagon, so my mother tells me how she had to walk to get the cows back to the other place where they lived. So it was several days, because my mother had told me where they stopped off and spent the night with some people en route from moving from this location to other. And when they moved back to the other location, there was a very little bit of a house there, and my grandfather, and my mother was the oldest, and my grandmother and my aunt that I spoke of, Aunt May or Aunt Molly, they cut timbers and other things to help rebuild the house, and went to the sawmill and other things, as my mother would tell me, about building the house back, or building the house. As I indicated earlier, the house wasn't very much. It had, in some cases, wooden shutters, and only a few places had windows in it. And of course, didn't have any screens or anything else. And also, they had to build all the outhouses for the cows and for the mules and for the other things they had to use to farm with, and didn't have very much. So it was a very difficult period for them at that time. This was a period that, as I say, they were farming, and in some cases they had to clean off a lot of the land of trees and other debris and things so they could even farm on. My mother used to tell me what a difficult period of time it was in her life.
So this transition in the lives of your mother early in life, involving her moving, this was a traumatic experience. Do you have a sense of that?
Well, it was. My mother was a very, very solid, sound person. She had a lot of pride. She wanted to do things that had never been she'd known anyone in her family to really do. She wanted to figure out how, and she's told me this, how to make some money. As I say, she went away one year and down close to Macon, Georgia, and lived with her family, and kind of tutored some kids and taught school some. My aunt has told me a little more about this in recent years. And she was gone away for some time to try to not only money for herself, but money for the family. My mother was very close to her sisters, and all members of her family, and she wanted to help them. I believe my mother was around 19 years old or 20 when she went to work at the state hospital, which was about 30 or 35 miles away from where she lived. My grandmother helped her. They sold some chickens and other things to raise some money for her to go. And as I've indicated earlier, that's where she met my father. And then she hadn't been working very long until she made arrangements for her sister, oldest sister, which is I refer to as Aunt May or Aunt Molly, it was her name, to come to work at the state hospital also. So her sister came to work there. And they both at that time would not only work but send some of their money home to the family. And Of course, later on, years later, the youngest sister came and lived with us, and of course I remember that period. And she went to a nurse's training and became a registered nurse. She also worked at the state hospital. Shortly after my mother married, my Aunt Molly, she married Mr. Leonard, and and Molly, and May is still living. She lives in right at the midway, where about 3/4 of a mile from, maybe not that far, where I was born, where she tells me, in the house that I was born in. And she lives right next door to the school that I went to. And so my next aunt, Aunt Lucille, she also shortly thereafter married, and she married a man in Monticello, Georgia, which was only about 20 miles away. And then my two uncles stayed home most of their life. My oldest uncle, because he was drafted in World War II, and he came back somewhat emotionally unstable, because I guess felt he had to come back home. By this time, grandmother and grandfathers were quite old, and he never was married, and he then took what he called a public works job at a naval ordnance plant in Macon, because he had veterans preference. The first time he had ever worked any places except the farm, and he still tried to continue to farm. And then my grandmother's brother, she called it her baby brother, who I guess was in his 70s or something then, came to live with him. And my grandfather died, and so he had to take care of my uncle, a great uncle, and my grandmother. And he had a very serious car wreck coming home one night from work. And I don't recall, I think it was 2 people was killed in the car wreck. My uncle never overcame that, and I guess, I don't remember whether it was months or about a year or so, I guess. He took his own life. So that left to, of course, my grandmother and my uncle living alone, and my grandmother was, I guess, in her 80s and early 80s. And so it's quite tragic from that point. By this time, everybody else is married and living elsewhere except my uncle, and I guess between the emotional disturbance of the war versus the auto wreck that he could not seem to overcome, and the pressures of my grandmother then, he took his own life, which was, as I say, quite tragic. My other uncle, he had gotten married, and he didn't live far away. He lived only about 2 miles away from the same farm place. In fact, I have 2 aunts and my uncle were living within a couple of miles of where they grew up all of these years and never had really moved away. My other uncle had gone to work for the forestry department of the state of Georgia, and he had one daughter, and she had been married, I guess, twice. She had 2 sons, and one of the sons killed my uncle and shot his grandmother, which was my aunt. She survived. This was not many years ago because of drug-related, I gather it was drug-related problems. I don't know. I wasn't that close to it. So there's tragedy then from that point in the family. All of my other aunts, every one of their sisters besides my mother is still living. My Aunt Molly is the oldest, and my Aunt Lucille, she is in her 80s, I guess, and My other two aunts was younger, so they are all living in they have I don't know 15 or 20 cousins. It is not a very big family in the sense that both sons were one by suicide and one by homicide, and therefore there was no Williamsons left. That was the end of that. So what I was speaking of a year ago, the family had kind of drifted apart as a result of a lot of these things. I had a dinner at the Holiday Inn in Milledgeville and invited everyone to the family, and I think practically everyone came. And I had some of this stuff. I had tried to do a little research to find out where they were, and I talked about the family and the background of the family. And as I indicated, very few of the members of the family that knew all parts of it. They knew certain parts of it because communication was very difficult. There was in those early days. Obviously, there was no telephones, and there was even mailing letters and writing letters could be done, but they had kind of drifted apart and brought them back together. But my mother, while she was living, had always tried to kind of hold the family together and was not only the big sister, she was kind of the den mother of the whole family. My grandmother came and lived with my mother after a period of time after my uncle had took his life, and my grandmother was living with my mother when she passed away. My grandmother was she still was quite a seamstress at the more quilting and other things at the time of her death. She was a little bit hard of hearing, but she'd pride herself in still threading a needle. When she died, she never wore any glasses, and it would have been nice if she could have had a hearing aid. But otherwise, she was generally in good shape, and she had milked her cows and looked after her farm and everything, or what was left of the farm, until she was well into her 80s. She, while she hadn't had any much formal education, she was quite a savvy lady of those times, and she was always interesting to talk to. In fact, I had already become Assistant Secretary of Labor when my grandmother died. She had outlived a lot of people in the family, much younger than she was. In fact, I'd already gotten gray-headed, and my grandmother would kid me about being gray-headed because she didn't have many gray hairs in her head, even to the point that she died. And I was wearing glasses, so she would kid me about wearing glasses too. So she was quite a lady to never have any real formal education or anything. She would have a big garden every year when she was when I was a kid, and she didn't like to bake and she didn't like to cook too much. That was the daughters had to do that. So, but what she wanted to do was look after a garden and look after her quilting and the other things that attracted her in life. She'd look after her cows and other things, but there were certain things that she would do. As I've said earlier, my grandfather, her husband, Roland Williamson, he didn't have any close relatives. All of those had passed away. He did have one sister that I can remember, but I can't remember very much about her. But his mother had passed away, and as I said, his father had left, and he took care of one of his brothers. My mother would talk about when she was young, her uncle that had served in the war, and of course the war at that time was a Civil War. In fact, my sister has a diary of his that he kept while he was in in the Civil War. Portions of it is not really legible anymore. It was for a long time. And I had a lot of memorabilia and other things that an uncle had brought back from the war, and he had lived with them until he died. And my mother also could tell me about her grandmother, which was my grandfather's mother, and she lived with him until he died. And that's the reason I said that my grandfather had a very difficult time. He had his mother. He had his uncle that came back from the war, and he had, of course, my grandmother and what family he had at that time, which was a very difficult period, and without having any money or any food much at that period of time.
What, if any, influence at the time did any of these people have on you? I'm thinking primarily of grandparents and aunts and uncles. We talked a little bit about this yesterday, but having had overnight to reflect, what you mentioned the word savvy. I think that's certainly a quality, an ability to analyze a situation, to understand and deal with complex situations. You mentioned is something that your grandmother had, and it's certainly something.
Well, first of all, I don't ever remember my family, any of them, maybe in later years, but I don't remember any of my family at that time complaining about their hardships or their problems in life. It was that's the way the world was. That's the way the period of time was for them. While there was a few people around that lived in the areas where they did, that probably had more, and obviously more, and of course, but the large number of people was almost in the same boat that they were in, and it was really the haves and the have-nots, and there wasn't too many haves. Most of it was the have-nots in that whole area. There was no, as I've indicated earlier, there was no wealth in my family any place. There had been some, on both sides, there had been earlier days, members of families who had owned huge tracts of land. But by kids and dividing it up and selling off and that sort of thing, all of that was pretty much done away with. I think it taught me a lot of things in life, that you have to go out for yourself and do some things, and that more than that, it instilled in me a genuine desire to help other people, and I've always wanted to help other people, and as we'll talk about a little later, it even became more vivid in my mind when I used to think back that both my mother and father was mistreated by the state of Georgia. And that comes later, and they never could exercise. Even my father couldn't exercise in the early days when I was a child. He couldn't exercise his really rights because he was always afraid about the politics. Because then in the early 30s and all, the state job was a great thing to have, even though you didn't make a lot of money. But every time you changed governors in Georgia, every 2 years, or county commissioners or somebody else, if you wasn't on the right side of the political fence, you didn't have any job. So you couldn't exercise your real freedom. So it was, I think the whole making was that there has to be I thought at that time, there has to be a better way for people in this life. There has to be we have to work to create a better world in which to live in. And I think they did in that. My grandparents did in their own way try to do that. They didn't. You couldn't. I think my grandfather on my mother's side would have actually. I think he just shot somebody if you went out and stole something. That was something you did not do. You wouldn't. And as I said earlier, he talked all the time about the 10th Commandments, why he never went to form the church all the time. He was constantly disciplining people on how you should live. In fact, he was a pretty tough disciplinarian. It wasn't anything easy about him. And my mother, as I said, my mother was more closely like him probably than any other one. My mother had a pretty good temper. My grandfather had a pretty good temper, and where I think I was a pretty good boy growing up, but I probably got if I added them all up, I don't know, 1,000 whippings. I was constantly by my mother about that you don't do that or you don't do this. I don't know. I never. At the moment when she finally got with whipping me, I might have disliked her for a few minutes, but it wasn't very long because she'd turn right around in a few minutes and do the things that was great for me in life. So I've always tried to discipline my life and help discipline others in what you're trying to do. So there's so much that I think was instilled in me in my early days. Strength. You have to be strong, and you just count your blessings if you're fortunate and things go great for you, and you work like hell if they're not on the other side, and you seek to overcome those things.
What were some of their priorities and their expectations?
Well,
as you were concerned?
their priorities, I think, on my mother's side, because as I indicated yesterday, I know more. I was closer to my mother's family because they were all younger. My grandfather married later in life, and they were all still kind of together as a family, as I remember. My father's family, they had all gone away when I was there, and I would just go there. But I go to my grandfather's, and I think especially was that the teachings was you have to learn. You have to get the best knowledge you can and understanding, and we have to figure out how do we make life better. And my grandfather and my grandmother was constantly trying to do things to improve not only their own lives, but more give the kids they had an opportunity to do things from this point. It was not easy. My grandfather, on my mother's side, lived unto himself, and only in recent years have I come to kind of think that, trying to analyze him a little bit in my own mind, that while he might have showed it in his temper some, that the only bitterness that I know about him was about his father leaving and not taking care of his responsibilities. And also my grandfather, and we used to laugh at this on that side, he really felt that even after the kids, my grandmother and all that, and they always did until he died, I think, except when they was married, they'd give him a portion of their earnings. He was supposed to bring it home, you understand, so that it can be used by everybody. And it was, I don't know that times like that exist anymore with anybody, you understand? In some ways, I'm damn glad they're not. On the other hand, it was a family of people that didn't have much, that you didn't have to worry about. They would protect your interest, and they wasn't about to take from anyone that didn't belong to them. They were not about to beg, I don't think. I don't know that there was any of that part in it. Because in some ways, as I said yesterday, I could go to the spring box and get the butter and the buttermilk, and they would have probably, my grandmother probably cooked something, and for they came out of the garden or something, or in the winter she would open some canned goods or something, or the dried fruit she would make something out of. But I remember in the early 30s, when I was very small and go there, that it wasn't very much food. It was enough, it was plenty of what they had, but it would just be made cornbread and beans or a couple other things. I mean, it wasn't any great meal that you'd see today, but people lived and they survived.
Sure. How important do you think this incident that you've referred to of your, I guess it was your great-grandfather on your mother's side, leaving the family, how important was that to this disciplined, in some cases punishment involved in that, emphasis within that family, or would it have existed anyway? looking back as you see it, do you think that had an influence on the way the families developed?
Oh, I'm sure that it did, but I didn't even, as I said yesterday, I didn't even realize that my aunt was telling me that when I was talking with her about this Christmas dinner that I was giving. So I don't even realize. I'm sure now, in retrospect, as I thought about my grandfather, I think it had a tremendous impact on them. Because again, if knowing what I know, that my mother would say we like to starve to death, and what I know what they had when I was a small kid, they really did like to starve to death.
Mm-hmm.
So I can't really say per se.
So what, if you had to summarize a family philosophy that would have characterized the family, let's say, into which your parents were born, if the two families were sufficiently different, could you summarize what that was? You've talked about discipline and a number of factors. Maybe we've already said enough. I just wanted, if there's a way of your summarizing your thoughts on that, I'd like for you to try to do that. If it's all, you know.
Well, it was a family that, before the phrase of the even corn, they believed in staying together. They were very close family to assist each other. They were certainly a family of honesty and integrity. They were a family that believed and not only doing good by their neighbors, but assisting others. And what can we do together to make life better for all? And again, there was nothing exceptional in my grandparents, I guess, that I know of from that point. I told you, I think, about my grandmother. She would say "damn Yankees" as if it is one word, you understand, and she believed all of that. My grandmother dwelled on that subject probably more than anyone else was in my whole family. My family was never, as I said earlier, never racist. I don't never know anything. We abided by the customs of the day pretty much from that point, but I don't never see hatred from that point. There was more bitterness because I talked more about that on my grandmother's side as a result, because all of their bad times was laid upon the Civil War as they grew up, and it was apparently, I don't know, it was a most terrible war. The suffering that went on after that is that's very few imagine how difficult it was. And I guess I really regret that I didn't have what I probably could have at that time, tape recorders or other things, to talk to my grandmother about that whole period. Because, as I say, that was something she loved to talk about more than anything else, you understand.
Was there a
And anybody that lived north of Atlanta was a damn Yankee as far as she was concerned, you understand, almost in her mind.
Excuse me, I was wondering what your recollections are about the black community in those early times. Were they sizable in number?
They were in my life, in the area where I lived, where my grandparents lived. There were very few black people in the early days living right in that area around where they were. There was some black families that lived with them. And not only did they exchange conversation, they swapped and borrowed from each other. There wasn't any mixing and mingling in the sense of socially, that sort of thing, because the customs didn't allow that to be happening. I'm not sure that that time, that it could not have happened, but it did not happen at that point. And that's almost true, somewhat true on my grandfather, on my father's side, that they were right where in the immediate area where they lived. When I remember, there were very few black people living in that area. Now there was, as I say, where I lived, there were black people who lived in and about all the times where I lived and around. In fact, we had neighbors that were black people lived close to us when I was a kid growing up, but there wasn't many in that area at that time. There was really no way to make a living. It would have been very difficult for a black person to own any land. It was hard enough for some of the white people in order to make a living. So you'd either had to have been a sharecropper or worked by the hour a day. Now, and on my father's side, I remember going to see them in the summertime, and there would be quite a number of black people helping pick cotton, both men and women. Now, I don't know I can't recall really where they came from. They didn't live right in that area from that point. Because even as a kid, there'd always be a saying, well, if I can't ever do anything else, I can pick cotton. And of course, now we find out that you can't even go pick cotton anymore from that point. But as I've said, there wasn't any black people that right close by. Not many, anyway.
I think this has been helpful in terms of clarifying the lives of your grandparents. I feel good about it. I'd like to move now.
Hey, you want to go to my father's side a little bit, though? That's all I'm saying.
Well, okay.
No, I'm just asking you.
No,
so we didn't.
let's do that. Let's do that.
On my father's side, his father's name was John Allen Usery, and my father had a brother named John Usery, and his name was John Allen, I believe, and named after my grandfather. And then there was, I think then there was the sister, Sally Usery, and then that was my father, and then, no, excuse me, I said that wrong. The oldest was Clement Usery, and he was the oldest son. And then there was my Aunt Sally, my father, and Johnny was a little bit younger than my father. And then there was Mary Usery, and then there was Ray Usery. And as I indicated yesterday, my grandmother died just before armistice was signed in World War I. She died thinking that both my grandfather and my father was going to the service, and she died with the flu. When I was a kid, my Uncle Clement, my Uncle John, and my Aunt Sally, and all of those was old enough and had already gotten married and did not live at home. So when I would go visit my grandparents, they or them, it would just be my grandfather and my grandmother, step-grandmother, and it's sometimes the youngest boy, Ray, would be at home, not all the time, just some of the time with that. And living close by was a number of families, and was Deasons, and as I had said yesterday, the Deasons and the Userys married each other, so there was either it was an aunt and an uncle, and there was it would get hard to even for me to understand sometimes, because all of this wound up with double first cousins, and there were a lot of them. And the Deasons were not quite the same family that I talked about, the Williamson, when it came to, and I don't want to say they wasn't good people, but they wasn't as scrupulously honest in dealings and everything else. So they would involve themselves in a lot of what I would call sometimes marginal things and other things. And I'm still saying good people, but they were more seeking to grab whatever's out there. For the better. I'm talking about generally at that point. I had a great uncle that owned this big general merchandise store. He had owned a grist mill. He had owned a grocery store and all. And he had sought to achieve a lot and would let people have credit and all other things so that they could collect interest and a lot of other things. So there's a little more ways to make money on my father's side than there was on my mother's side from this point. My father is probably, there is not a finer, as I said yesterday, my father has always been very active in church, and my grandfather was. Fine Christian families, Baptist. My father has been going to church, involved in church in a lot of capacities all of his life. My father was highly respected. My grandfather was highly respected. And where again, that life had been pretty tough for him. It wasn't quite as tough as it was for my grandparents on the other side, because they lived first of all, the land was a little bit better where they was. My grandfather Usery had a little better education. He was not caught with the things that my other grandfather was, and having to take care of a family and that. And he moved about some, and he had sons old enough to help him run a farm and do some other things. So overall, where it wasn't a great deal better, their lifestyle was better than my mother's lifestyle was. My Uncle Clement, he has passed away. My Uncle John has passed away. My Aunt Sally has passed away. My Uncle Ray has passed away. So we two people living in that side of the family now. That whole group. That's my father and his younger and his sister that's next to him, that's younger than he is. My father is 86. He has, as I've indicated earlier, he's been in relatively good health until recently. It's more of a loss of memory, immediate memory with him now, although he has had some physical ailments. But my father, as I said, I don't think you go to where he's lived and grew up that no one would say anything but something kind about him and something very respectful about him. My father was a little bit on the, we never had much either, but my father was a little bit on, I always thought, on the stingy side a little bit. He's always, people kid him about squeezing a nickel and that sort of thing. But his reputation is very fine. We moved after my mother and he married, and I guess they got married in 1922, I think is when it was. Because I was born in 1923, and born at home, but in an area right close to Midway. The post office was Hardwick, Georgia. Later on, I don't know whether the post office was even there. I think it was because the state hospital's at Hardwick, Georgia. And all of this was within a mile or so of each other. But Midway is a community, and it's almost all part of Milledgeville now, but Midway was a midway point between Milledgeville and Scottsboro. Milledgeville was laid out as a state capital. And Scottsboro was another community. Scottsboro never got off the ground very much because it remained a small community, but Midway was about halfway between that point. And there was a forks of the road that you went to what was Oberthorpe University in the early days, Oberthorpe College. fact, Midway, the school that I went to, started out at one time to be a college, and it wound up eventually being a high school, and then back to a grammar school as it is today. So it's probably one of the oldest schools in that area. So I was born in that area, in a house that I think is still standing, I'm not sure. Born at home. My Aunt Molly was with my mother when I was born. And while I was very young, we moved from that house we moved 3 or 4 times when I was a kid. We always had rental property until I was, I guess, 12 years old or something. My father bought this small place right next to the Baptist church. We always lived within rock's throw of the Baptist church or the Christian church or the Methodist church, and even in my life, everything pretty much centered around the church and school. And of course, I have one sister. She's 5 years younger than I am. I remember when my sister was born. My sister was born at home also, but in a different house than where I was. Though myself and my sister was the only 2 kids in my family from that point. My father worked for the state, I think 43 years, state hospital. He retired from the state hospital. My mother worked off and on when I was a kid. She didn't work during the birth of obviously my sister, a period of time, and she would work most of the time. So actually, again, while we didn't have a lot, we was average, or if anything, maybe a little bit better than average. I grew up only because my mother and my father both worked. We had a marvelous black girl that became
We are resuming our interview with Secretary Bill Usery. When we broke off, of course, he was talking about the family setting, the immediate family setting in which he lived. I do want to follow up on a question that I posed earlier about the family philosophy of his mother's family, only directed at his father's family in this case, and perhaps some comparisons between the two. We talked about this a bit during the break. How would you summarize, in just a few words, the approach of your father to life, and then perhaps compare that with the approach of your mother?
Well, I've said before, my father was a very religious man. He likewise was a very honest person. My father was more easygoing. My father would try to keep things from creating an issue. He would be try to take an extra step or walk extra to get involved in a feud or a fuss or a fight or anything. My father, as I've indicated, was very frugal. If anything, brought it on as, I think, being what people would say tight. But my father wanted to help others. He not only helped them with material things that we've had, but he certainly tried to help them in any way that he could in resolving issues that would come up or matters. He did that in the community. He did that in the church. I kiddingly say to people, they were getting it difficult in a union hall sometime, and I said not any more difficult than it was in a Baptist church sometimes. When I was growing up at a conference, my father was always somewhat a stabilizing force between people who had strong disagreements on the whole issue. And my father would take an extra step not to offend you anyway. While my mother didn't want to offend you, but if she thought she had been fair in every way, she would consider it more you offending her than she offended you. So that was quite a difference in the personality of my father and mother as to the approaches to life and to people. While both was honest, my mother was very strong and forceful. My father was somewhat more laid back and somewhat cautious to move into something. He would deliberate longer about whether this should be done or shouldn't be done, how it should be done, and that sort of thing. He was just generally more cautious in every way about what he went about doing things.
Very helpful. We mentioned in the break, of course, that sort of puts your father in the role of a mediator or conciliator of
Well, he was, because my father was in his family, all members of his family, my brothers and aunts and uncles, any type of trouble they had, they came to my father. My father was in the whole family, not just his brothers, but other members of the family. Any problems that arose, they'd come to my father. My father tried to help resolve those problems for him. And more so, and I think would normally be found in the family from that point. My father had an entirely different personality than his brothers had. My father was basically pretty serious all the time. He worked hard, worked long hours. He was always going to be quite concerned that not only he's on work on time, he's doing what he's supposed to do. My father was more concerned about satisfying people in every way, and took extra steps to try to do that. So it was, he played kind of that role in his entire family. I remember when my father died, my grandfather was killed or died, and my father was chosen as the person to figure not only the administrator of the family, because they all liked him, but how to divide up the property, how to do this, how to do everything else, and even that was a little bit of feuding. They wanted this or they wanted that, and my father was tried to be the peacemaker before that whole process to get it all worked out. And on several other occasions, my father was called over to assist other people in this whole area. I guess before I knew what an arbitrator was about or anything, my father was kind of in that kind of role in that background a little bit, going to try to help resolve problems. So I never thought about it too much in that whole length. That's more what his personality was. My mother could have been involved in a dispute, obviously many times quicker than my father could have. My father would have been much softer, easygoing in every way.
and yet respected.
And yet very much respected, very highly respected. My father was very highly respected in the community and where he grew up. My father did what was always what he thought was his civic duty by, say serving on the jury, somewhat active in the school that I went to, and he was always like on a pulpit committee, and he was on committee to get another principal for the school and different things. As I remember when I was a kid, he was a balancing force between a lot of people at this point. My father not only had a fair education himself, going to the London schoolhouse, but working at the state, he really took pride in trying to educate himself. My father was pretty well versed. He was always very interested in politics and political affairs, but he could not voice much of that early because of his job that he had. But he was always interested in that whole process. He was always interested in people getting out to vote, going to vote. He was interested in people participating in the community affairs and the other things in the community that I grew up in and that we lived in. So it was all around. My father, as I say, not only was respected, he was very active in his community in the ways that he could be. He enjoyed it very much.
Was your mother, did your mother get involved in these similar kinds of things, school, or, of course, politics was not typically as open for women even after they got the right to vote. But of course, I'm not sure your mother was typical either.
No, my mother would have been more like, as I said earlier, my mother, I hadn't thought about it, but my mother would have been in the leading front of women's rights, or as some would say, women's lib. She would have been looking out for that. While my mother, I think, very well knew as a mother and a wife what her duties and responsibilities was to her home, but she also knew that she had a life of her own, in a sense, and my mother was always seeking to achieve, to make life better, not only for herself but the others who was around her. She seized upon every opportunity that she had, I think, to advance herself. And my mother was very bold. I remember my mother, we went one time, she went, I'll never forget this, I went with my mother I wanted to buy some new uniforms, a new pair of pants. My mother went with me to a bank in Millersville and to borrow $20. And he wouldn't let her have it. And he said that she should be teaching me to save, not to borrow money. And my mother gave him a lecture on how important education was when people were going to school, and that everybody didn't have the same opportunity that he had to be born into a family, I'll never forget it, that had money. And I mean, we walked out of there when my mother says, we don't have the $20, but you can hold your head high. My father, he would have thanked the banker for being kind to us and letting us come in, you understand? Sorry he couldn't get the $20, but he understood. My father would have understood. My mother was not about to say she understood, you understand? You get a loan money and we're going to pay it back, and it'll be lecturing me on what we should do or should not do. And it's probably as good a contrast between my mother and father as I could invent. First, probably my father would have probably agreed with the banker, you were right. I've been trying to tell him he should put money in the bank, I'll be taking it out, you understand? Trying to get something. But my mother was smart enough that she sees on the opportunity of education, you understand? And I don't know that, well, I have a little money in Mediator, I don't have any in that bank, I can tell you.
Did you early generate the idea of going ahead in education as a means of achievement? And it would seem that came from your mother, if that was so.
Yes, my education, I can't, I was a very good student in school on probably the last couple of years I was in school. And I don't want to ever, I take the full responsibility myself and not on something else. I was, of course, graduated from high school in 40, and of course, the environment in which we was living in 1940 in that period of time, and one of my friends was had gone off to the National Guard and gone off to the Army and gone off to all the other things. So my education was really interrupted at that whole time by the period of time in which we was living. More and more people was being encouraged to go to work in defense and do this, and it was by this time the times had changed a lot from where I was saying early. There was a lot of jobs, a lot of job opportunities, a lot of other things. So, and two, I, like a lot of other students, I guess, call myself, my mother had done a lot for me then. It was time for me to make a little bit of money before I tried to go any further, and I went to work for a while there with for a man and owned this big general merchandise store and a lot of other things, and before I went off to a defense plant later on. But I had, also being in a military school and the military being involved, and there was a lot of recruiters and everything else at that time, so that kind of changed my whole plans about education per se. And as I said, looking back, I had not been a very good student that last year that I was in school. I passed, but I hadn't been a very good student from that point, looking back. Because for years and years I had such a burning desire to, I think from my mother, to know more about the things of life in the world, and to achieve that was through an education process.
I remember yesterday you mentioned something about having an early ambition to maybe be governor of the state, and
yeah, that was primarily because, as I say, my mother and my father both had worked for the state, and we elected, most all officials were elected every 2 years, because the sheriff was obviously at that time considered a very important thing. He was the executive officer of the county, and he was a very powerful person. And then you had the county commissioners. But more important, if you worked for the state, it was the governor and the state legislatures and the others from that point. And electing governors every 2 years, so many of my friends' parents, for no reason at all, lost their job because they wasn't on the right, or wasn't perceived of being on the right political side. And of course, state jobs was a plum, and they didn't have any real protection then, so they would lose their jobs for no reason. And then maybe 2 years later, they'd come back and get a job better than my father had, or something else, you understand, at that point. So there was nothing fair in the system. Because I grew up kind of thought it was a damnable way to run a system as it was run then, because there was didn't have any type of, let's say, really personnel protection or anything at that point in time. And I figured the sheriff wasn't enough and the county commission wasn't enough. The only way you could really straighten out how they treated state employees was by being governor of the state and straighten out that mess that they would cause. People would move in a state house and have state running water. The next 2 years they'd move out of state house and didn't have any place to live really. Sometimes they'd be strong enough to hold on to a state house. Sometimes they wasn't be strong enough to have one. My father never lost his job, as I said, because he was just trying to be fair with everybody and trying to accommodate everybody and not offend anybody. So by not offending anyone, he was able to hold on to his job. I think he probably stayed now, in retrospect, concerned about my mother offending somebody sometime about something at this point, but he was always concerned of holding on to it. So he would talk about he was in line to become superintendent of this building or some other job, as I remember. And then he would come home all disappointed because he didn't get that job or something. And of course, my mother would say, I can understand you. You let him run over you, you understand? Well, that's the way old so-and-so would treat you anyway. You play by the rules and he doesn't play by the rules. I can remember my mother saying that to some degree. Well, anyway, that whole process started me to wanting to help people who could not help themselves. And it starts back with my grandparents who really wanted to do something, but they haven't had any opportunity, any choice. And how do we give people a better opportunity to do the things? And so when I came back from the Navy, jumping a little bit, I was wanting to go to law school. Law school, I still had ambitions for political office in Georgia. Because it never came that way. And I decided that being governor of Georgia is not the greatest thing you can achieve anyway from that point since then. But that's generally how that was. You see your friends that you play with. 2 years that they got all the good things of all those things we thought was the good things of life, and then 2 years they didn't have anything, and then you could see a kid that all of a sudden his father could buy him baseball bats and all the other things because he had a big job at the state this time, and then every time he wanted to play baseball, the kid get mad and he'd run home with all his baseball bats and gloves, and you had no way of spreading it around, in a sense. So the whole object as my desire was, as I said, to do something about the personnel practices and the labor relations practices, and I didn't know it from the point of personnel or labor at that time, but the rights of people to hold their jobs if they was doing it right, and the rights to get promoted, and the rights to if people tried to be good in that community and they worked hard and they had seniority and they had all the things that they needed to do a particular job, shouldn't be denied that job because they didn't vote for somebody or didn't get out and work for somebody. Even if you did vote for them, you didn't get out and work for them, or you didn't give them any money, and you might not have any money to give them. That system had to go. And fortunately, that system did go over a period of time to a greater degree. We still suffer some of the problems in those areas, but for a large degree, they are not like they were then.
It sounds that there were now and then there was a lot of anxiety in your home then on your father's part about political climate changing and.
Oh yeah, and looking back, I don't know. This is probably more now. And I'm sure that it would be accurate. My father probably, and I can remember him talking about things, and maybe it was wishful thinking on his part, but he was going to achieve certain things. And I'm sure he probably said some things to also keep my mother satisfied in a number of areas, you understand at this point. And most likely my father did think he was respected, he was liked, he was active, he did his job, he did all the other things that he should be given this job or that job, whatever it was. But it would come and go, and of course that would be a disappointment for him. And but again, as I said, the disappointment for us was most of the time not achieving more, was not so much having less. A lot of people across the street or down the street had less because they no longer father had a job, and this was the latter part of the Depression. It goes starting in 34, 35. Well, not so much in 34, 35, but partially in that. But around 36, 37, we had all the WPAs and PWAs and federal projects and other things that heretofore hadn't been had. That was on that Roosevelt period of time from that point. And I'm sure that as we talk about it later on, part of these things was to a large degree contributed to my mother and my father separating this whole area. That was after I had gone to the Navy. But I'm sure that was the more contributing factor. my mother, I guess would be safe to say that she never thought that necessarily that she was better than anybody else, but my mother wasn't ready to give away that anybody was any better than she is. I mean, she was going to stand her ground in that whole area. I don't perceive my mother as one who said she had to keep up with the Joneses, so to speak. She was one that was seeking to always improve all aspects of life. My father was more inclined to be willing to accept status quo, and she was not.
To what extent was this resentment of the politicized employment practices at the state hospital shared by the employees, or articulated and shared by the employees? I mean, was it stated in the family councils that employees at the state hospital were being unfairly treated because of political influence or other factors of that sort?
Well, it was not something that dominated in my home, but it was something that you'd hear about and you would know, and not only in my home, but in the other homes I went in and the other kids I went in. I would just say you would see kids that the father was no longer working during that period of time, or the mother was not. And I'm talking about a period of time when 50 cents was quite a bit of money. And so you would, it was around you. You could observe it. And where I grew up, all that was there was the state hospital. And the state hospital was the largest, one of the largest in the United States, all concentrated in one place. Because now today, it's they have moved it all parts all over the state. But at that time, it was created. I mean, it was all right there, and it was a big institution, and there were in the community in which we live, 9 out of 10 people worked for the state. Maybe 8 out of 10 or something worked for the state hospital. And who didn't work was running a store or a few other things around, because it wasn't a farming community. On the outside, it was farming some. And if you wasn't working at the state, then you maybe doing work for yard keeping or some other things for some other people. It wasn't that many jobs. It wasn't any industry there outside of this. I can't even recall a thing that you could consider an industry right close by where was a cotton gin that a few people worked at, which obviously was at one time was a pretty important facility for any community to have, where people would bring their cotton in. But Milledgeville was 2 miles away, and that was the big city, so to speak, if you want to call it a big city, and the farming community and everything went to Milledgeville. The state people lived in Hodrick or Midway or in that area, you understand? So it was around you all the time. Politics took always it was up front because it was almost ongoing all the time. When you take, as I say, you elected governors every 2 years, and you hardly get through. They get everybody settled down, and what are you going to do? You start over again. You understand? And who do I side with this time? You understand? How to do that? So it was a and yet there are people at that state hospital now that about third, fourth generation living there. Sure. Now it's not near as a size now, as I say, as it was then. My father retired from there. My mother worked off at Orleans. My sister worked there, retired. My aunt Molly, she retired from there. I mean, you can go through members of my family. My Uncle Clement, he came there. He died when he was working there. My Uncle Johnny came there. He lived there, and worked there. My Aunt Sally, her husband, he worked there, and he died there. So all members of the family, I say all members of the family, at least half of the family, and either early or later. My mother was the first from her family to go there, and my father was, so they bring in others, because where it sounds that I say it was bad, it was better than anything else around. You understand? But that doesn't mean to say that it didn't need to be corrected, you understand? There was inequities. And I always thought that was not. I love our political system in this country. It's nothing worse than a cheap politician, you understand? And in some ways, he's going to promise and do everything else, and you got to get in office, you understand? And I knew that. I understood that. And the rules were, if you want to play, you got to play by the rules. If your man gets beat, you beat too, you understand? That's why I said jobs and other things has to be removed from that, because you affect people's lives. You don't not just affect a person. You affect a lot of people.
Of course, the Talmadges were very important to this state. Gene Talmadge at that time, was he? How was a figure like Talmadge thought of in either your family or in the community, or were there other political figures that had a identifiable image, and what was thought about them, if any?
Well, of course, Talmadge Gene Talmadge was a very powerful figure in the state. He was a commissioner of agriculture before that, because I used to hear about him because my grandparents and them and others farming, from this point. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, when he ran for governor, and of course he was governor 4 or 5 times, I guess. And he was always, if he wasn't governor, he was either running for governor or about to run or something else. So there was quite a period of time there when he was a very powerful force. And it wasn't always, looking back, the governor himself or others, but it was the lieutenants of the governor who was the power brokers in Baldwin County or in Milledgeville or at the state hospital. And sometimes you could even you could be do the right things yourself, but the power broker in between you gets crossed some way. You understand? So you could be a victim in a number of ways. You understand? Sure. In this whole process. So it provided a better life for my mother and my father, and gave me a pretty good life. It just wasn't right, is all. And what we need to do is to kind of square this away. And then, and that was true in most of the jobs that you had. See, that wasn't any. There was a child labor law, and gosh, we didn't even get the minimum wage till in the 30s. You understand?
That's right.
So there was no protection at all. So I had a desire. How do you protect people that go to work for you? And you say, well, you go to work for John Blow. He has a right to hire you, and he has a right to fire you. But does he have a right to fire you if you've given your life to him and everything to him, and you're working for him, and all of a sudden just fire you? Don't need you anymore. How do you be a good citizen? How do you be fair and seek to play by the rules, and then not get mistreated? And all of my life, starting early in my life, as I say, from what I've seen from my grandparents, especially through the state, that we have to change the system a little bit, and that was certainly true at the state. And fortunately, as I said, my father would balance that act to good enough that he never lost his job. He never lost his job for 43 years. But that's when I say he was different. My mother would have probably lost hers 3 times. She did. I don't know whether she was. I don't think she was ever fired. She either quit or transferred or something else. But my mother would have probably lost hers over here because she wasn't about to take all of that, if you follow me, that sense, which was a different personality, different nature from the two.
Well, let's. It's funny. We've been talking about your coming on the scene and the influences on you, but of course, in 1923, you were born. And what are your first memories of your parents, your home, your immediate community, and so on. Could you reflect a little bit on your very first impressions of family and of community?
Well, I don't really, obviously the first thing I remember, but my mother and father was both, had a nice home life. I mean, we didn't have any big house or anything. We didn't have a lot. We had food. And we went to church. About the earliest things I remember is going to church. That was the place we'd go. We lived in a community where there were houses all around us. We didn't live out someplace. We had neighbors all around us, where we didn't have any formal playgrounds or anything. We could play with the kids. Neighbors' kids come over to my house, and I go over to their house. And of course, when I started to school, and I remember when I started to school, I walked to school, which wasn't too far away. It was about a mile and a half, I guess, to school. I do know this, that, as I said earlier, and we haven't got to it, we had this black lady that worked for us, such a fine woman, and her family lived just down below us at one point. And I can recall in my earliest memories that people asked me about it, that I thought the worst thing again that ever happened, that after years after I'd walk to Midway School, and the school bus there would pick up the older kids to take them to the high school in the city. And the black people had to walk right by that schoolhouse and walk almost to where the other people went to school. And I knew that used to drive me up the wall, that those black people can't ride on the school bus. And it would be raining and it would be bad weather and other things from this point. I remember the first day I went to school, as I said, I went to this Midway School. Of course, I also remember when we wasn't any, my mother would cry because I didn't, we had biscuits, and I didn't like cold biscuits, so somebody told my mother I threw away my lunch. I wouldn't eat it because I didn't like cold bread. And again, it wasn't that we didn't have food, it just wasn't the right food that I wanted. I remember in the locker room when they put the first, what later became child lunch, I guess, but they put milk there. They had surplus milk, and of course this was I guess 33, probably 34, I don't know. Later on, that I think it was, I don't know that I can remember whether they ever had any lunch per se, but I think we did have some other kind of surplus. Something was given to us, but milk we was given. Kids coming to school in cold weather and didn't have any shoes, you know. There's a lot of things that I remember that whole area. But again, I felt pretty good. I had a very fine mother and father, and I had a home to go to, and I was never hungry, and I don't know that I was ever cold or anything. As I said, it was a nice little community. It was good people. They were really, most everybody was God-fearing people. There was a few what you would call, I guess today is termed town drunks or something, but generally everybody knew everybody. You didn't lock your doors of the house or anything. You didn't have to lock any doors of your house. You just went out and went on where you was going. Nobody was going to bother anything. You didn't have to worry about any crime per se, and occasionally there would be somebody that would get into serious trouble. And when I say serious trouble, to go to prison, to go to jail or something. And this included, as I said, 3 or 4 family of blacks that lived very close to where I lived for a longer period of my life, about 6 or 7 years we lived in this one house, and that was. I wasn't allowed to go in their house, and they didn't come in our house, but we played together. I mean, we didn't have any problem at that point. And played baseball and so forth, but as I say, it was supposed to be by customs, and it was by anything else. We didn't have any race relations, as people later to come to say that. And sure, I recognized at that time that the black people wasn't given the rights that they should have had. As I said, it started out with me about riding a school bus. I got in an argument one time when I was a little bit older about why couldn't a black boy ride a school bus, you know. The hell, the school bus not full, and you're going right by where the school is, and you can't even ride, you understand. But that wasn't, it was just, it was even with all I've said, it was a pretty good life, I thought. We had to buy most of our school books then, because you would either have to borrow, and I didn't have, early days I didn't have many school books. We had a governor come along, Ed Rivers, who gave us free school books, you understand, partly free school books as well from that point in the public schools. Your parents, in this case my mother, would always be struggling to either borrow or buy used books, school books or textbooks, or crayons or chalk or whatever else you need in school today that we take for granted, but it wasn't taken for granted when I was in school at that point. I had very fine teachers in school in the early days, it was because mostly, as I remember, in my early days was home, school, and the church.
Could you
We didn't
describe?
go anyplace else. We didn't have any automobile then. We didn't go anyplace. So occasionally, my mother and I, and it was almost an all-day run to go about 25 miles to my grandparents' place, to my mother's. You'd have to take the train up to Matching and then take a connecting train over to something else, you understand, and then the whole process. So it's we didn't go to Milledgeville very often. That was only 2 miles away. During that period of time, my father obviously would go, I guess. But there were a lot of people who came along peddling fresh fruits and vegetables in the springtime. They come along in a wagon, something like a covered wagon, only it wouldn't be covered in the sense a covered wagon, selling beef, meat. Icemen come along. The streets wasn't paved. They'd bring the convicts along, the prisoners who in their stripes, and work the roads and clean out the ditches. You'd see I remember seeing these guards with the guns on their shoulders, and making these prisoners sing, because they wouldn't let them talk to each other, you understand? Make them sing as they would pick up pick the ground, change. We had a streetcar, a dummy, they call it. It didn't look like any streetcar, that ran from Hardwick to Milledgeville, and that was by some law they passed. Took them years to get it off, but they had to run that streetcar so often a day from Milledgeville to Hardwick, and that was because that was started out when Milledgeville was the capital back then, and the Georgia Railroad was, as I recall, was really. Legislature put up some money in the early days to build a railroad, and then they had the state. See, Milledgeville was the state capital, and it had a state college. It had a state prison at one time. It had the state, what they call it, a state reform school. It had the state mental hospital. All the state facilities at one time was basically located in Milledgeville. And of course, after that war, the capital was moved to Atlanta. Well, it moved around 3 or 4 times during the war, and most of the other facilities stayed there. In later years, was moved at that point. But occasionally, we'd go to Milledgeville. We'd ride that streetcar, but other times we would walk. Somebody else would be going that you could maybe ride with. it wasn't uncommon at all to see a lot of wagons and a lot of horses and a lot of buggies even when I was a kid. Now, along about when I was probably 8 or 10 years old, you began to see more automobiles. After Roosevelt became president, as I say, and doing the 30s thing, the economy began to pick up some, and you began to see more and more active in this whole area. And the public works projects, like I said, they built a lot of new state buildings over at that time too. And goes into a lot of people went to work. So shortly after I started at school, and after about the 3rd grade, I guess, looking back, you can almost see how things were beginning to change. And they were changing for 2 reasons: the philosophies and policies of the Roosevelt administration, but also, in retrospect, the building up toward what eventually was World War II, and what began to be more of a war effort, even though we were saying we were staying out of the war. I mean, you can almost see that whole picture. My 3rd grade teacher, for instance, was Mrs. Ashfield, and she would drive a new Oldsmobile. And of course, she would lock it up, but you would stand around and look at Ms. Ashfield's Oldsmobile, and wonder, could I ever have something like that? You follow me? The point, because her husband was the Oldsmobile dealer, could do that. Didn't have any gymnasium at school. We played basketball outside, or we played football. We didn't have anything like that. Had outdoor toilets, obviously. Didn't have any indoor toilets at the school from that point of time. Didn't have any drinking fountains. You had a well. And sometimes I remember they get some ice to put in a cup, because you was always, as a kid, you was always, in early days of school, talked to about bring your own drinking cup and don't drink after people, and that. But it wasn't uncommon to drink after people from that point. I remember when they paved the street in front of the schoolhouse. It was a very exciting period. Things were beginning to happen, and while I didn't fully recognize what it was, in retrospect, I really see how it was, and the changes, and I know the changes that came about.
I know that most of us can't remember very well our preschool years, but let's just try to get some of the facts, objective facts, in mind. During what, if any, of that preschool period did your mother work outside the home? Do you have any knowledge of that?
She worked. This is going to be a contradictory term, I guess. She worked irregular, but quite regular, and that's what I'm going to say from this point. She didn't have a full-time job, but she would nurse. She would do a lot of things, off and on. And then there were times that she would work pretty long periods of time. She worked at state. She worked at what they call, it was a place called Allen's Hospital, and it was a private hospital for World War I veterans and mentally disturbed people whose families were wealthy enough to send them to a private institution rather than a public institution. She'd worked there quite a bit at nursing. She would do a little bit of private nursing. My mother took in sewing quite a bit. My mother was a very fine seamstress. I mean, she was an exceptionally good seamstress. My mother would bake some cakes and other things. She sold some cakes for Christmas holidays, weddings, events. My mother had me working on a flower garden. My mother loved flowers, and she could grow anything. She could make anything grow. I don't care what it is. She'll give her a pitch of it, and she'd make it grow. She would sell some flowers during the holidays. My mother was she she took advantage of every opportunity, frankly, I think.